When I first became Catholic, if I was going to pick up something to read to study the faith, it was almost exclusively going to be something contemporary. So examples of that would be like encyclicals by John Paul II or Benedict XVI, modern apologetics, and devotional literature originating at least in the latter half of the 20th century. And then as I worked my way through those resources, I eventually started to read older Catholic texts like older encyclicals and councils, church fathers, and scholastic sources. And I have to admit, I was a bit dumbstruck by how sharp the contrast was between the older texts and the newer ones that I was more familiar with. And I had heard people claim that there was a rupture in the Catholic Church that took place in the 20th century, and not having had much experience of that myself, I have to admit I didn't really pay much sympathy towards those kinds of sentiments. They always seemed to be a bit extreme and hysterical to me. But through this process of reading a more comprehensive body of literature, my own sensibilities on such claims have, I'll say, they've grown in sympathy. Now, I don't agree that there's been a rupture in the fundamental sense, as if to say the essence of the church has been lost. But I do think that there is a striking transformation that took place within the church over the 20th century. And it's what I would describe as the misplacement of ornamentation. Any wise person will tell you that there's a time and a place for most things. The book of Ecclesiastes explicitly tells us this. It says there's a time to kill or be healed, to build or to tear down, to love or to hate, and so forth. And I would naturally extend this to other facets of life. Like there's a time to dress up for certain occasions meant to commemorate the dignity and honor of the particular occasions that they signify. And then there's a time to dress down in anticipation of work and toil and exercise, or because of the casual nature of some event. And the same is true in communication, in how we share and wrestle with what is true with one another. There's a time in which poetic and metaphorical language is the most appropriate. And there's a time when brevity and precision are best. Marriage vows, for example, should be poetic. Divorce papers should be a little more exact in meaning. I think you obviously get the idea. So historically in the Catholic Church, ornamentation has been a key ingredient in communicating what it is that the church is about and what it is that it represents. And there was a conspicuous continuity in the way that ornamentation was used in art, design, and especially in worship. Because when we worship, we are fixing our gaze on God in adoration, God who is beauty itself. And so it makes sense that we would try to accentuate our worship with ornamentation. That's why we sing, for example. We're ornamenting our prayers with something beautiful to elevate our hearts and minds to God. This is also why the devotional language in prayer tends to be much more romantic and sentimental than a canon from an ecumenical council or from canon law might be. One is meant to stir up our hearts, while the other is meant to strictly define some doctrine of observance. And theology, I would argue, needs to discriminate the appropriateness of ornamentation, because theology is faith-seeking understanding. God has revealed certain truths about himself using a variety of communication styles, often poetic, mystical, and metaphorical, which we see explicitly in the Bible. But theology is an attempt to bring clarity to that revelation where there might be confusion about what God meant by his words or his actions. And if clarity is the aim of theology, then it would make sense that we would want to see more reasonable limits placed on something like ornamentation. It's just not really the place or time for that kind of thing. It's like showing up to a legal hearing with a judge wearing some elaborate ball gown. It's a distraction in that case. And historically, I would argue that much of our theology has enjoyed this kind of brevity and clarity, especially in church councils. They often read like legal documents or government legislation. Here's what we believe. Here's what we don't believe. Anyone who chooses the latter is anathema. Now, fast forward to the 20th century, and it seems like we've suddenly become really confused about when ornamentation is appropriate and inappropriate. For example, we went through a pretty dramatic, and even some would say traumatic, liturgical revision in the Latin Rite during this time, which could be characterized by how much has been stripped out of it in an almost iconoclastic fanaticism. The documentary Mass of the Ages portrayed this kind of demolition with a startling sequence of visuals. At the exact time when ornamentation is appropriate and called for in our liturgy, our worship, our music, our sacred art, our architecture, all the fixtures of culture meant to arouse our affection, we bewilderingly decided to strip it all away. And simultaneously, our theology, that respectable discipline meant to bring clarity and precision to our understanding of the faith, seemed to somehow inherit all of that ornamentation that had been orphaned from our sanctuaries, with the result of our theology, far from being in the service of dispelling confusion, became, I would argue, a significant source of confusion and misinterpretation within the church. That's why we can talk about the spirit of Vatican II as distinct from the actual documents of Vatican II. I've never heard anyone say anything about like the spirit of Vatican I or of the Council of Trent, because it's pretty difficult to read a meaning into those councils that isn't explicitly there. And that's worth pausing and discussing a little bit more, because the Council of Trent was addressing one of the most significant challenges the Catholic Church had ever faced in the Protestant Revolution. If ever the risk of being excessive was present, it was at that moment in history. And this is what the texts from the Council of Trent look like. By contrast, this is what the compiled text of Vatican II looked like. And Vatican II wasn't responding to some urgent and complex controversy like Protestantism. And that isn't meant to be just some cheap visual comparison. If you read both of these, you can't help but be struck by how dramatic the contrast between them is. I just recently went from reading Vatican I to then immediately after taking up Vatican II again, and the contrast was jarring. Vatican II felt like a devotional text when you read it side by side with Vatican I. And so if my assessment is accurate, I would argue that we as a church need something like a course correction. We need to better understand when ornamentation is appropriate and when it's just a distraction. In our worship, we need a restoration of beauty and ornamentation. Because minimalism and modernism and now postmodernism, which have been dominating a lot of the inspiration for what goes into our music and our architecture and our sacred art, those things as artistic movements are just philosophically incompatible with the Catholic tradition, and certainly with the notion that beauty is objective. And so modernist forms of art, they just feel really out of place in Catholic worship. And that's why once the novelty is worn off, which it now has, it's hard to appreciate those old churches and those old hymns designed in the 60s and 70s. Yet churches designed prior to the 20th century are capable of drawing like a universal appreciation in their aesthetic. We need new artistic movements in the service of the church that reject modernism and postmodernism as philosophies that are incompatible with our worship, and which show a renewed appreciation for the dignity and the suitability of ornamentation as a means of communicating and encountering beauty. And when it comes to theology, I think we need a renewal of the art of precision and clarity. Can I ask you to stick around for one extra minute? Because if you enjoyed that, well, first of all, thanks for watching. But now I could really benefit from your help, which you can do in a couple of ways. You can check out my sponsor, Real Estate for Life, who is a network of pro-family real estate agents that can connect you with one in your area. So if you're looking to buy a home, check them out at realestateforlife.org. And if you can help out directly financially, I tend to trust that most of my regular viewers can afford to drop a $5 tip in my jar once a year. And if they did, I wouldn't have to worry about the financial viability of this effort. So if you do want to support, you can go to brianholdsworth.ca/support, or join me in my locals community to get exclusive content and chances to interact with me and members of the like-minded community at brianholdsworth.locals.com.